It's here in the city.
It's here in the city.
This is here in the city.
This is here in the city.
I'm Sara Harris.
I'm Sara Harris.
New message.
Truth should be truth, but then it depends on, in the telling, whose truth is it?
We're here most Tuesdays, bringing you radio realities from the urban landscape
and mapping the city with voices of creative social change in and around Los Angeles. On Pacifica Radio, powered by the people, thanks to the generous support of you, our listeners, the capable crew at KPFK, the innovators of web-based radio at SoundCloud, news you might have missed at newsdesk.org, and the community-funded reporting project, Spot Us.
You can find us on the web at Here in the City. That's HEARinthecity.org.
They look somewhere between a collie and a German shepherd with a grayish, yellow, brownish, black coat, bushy tail with a whitish black tip at the end, pointy ears, a pointy nose. I would always describe them as being a very beautiful animal. They're very smart. They know how to survive.
Navajo legend holds that Coyote placed the stars in the sky before humans walked the earth. Coyote was clever and vain and placed his own image in the sky before any of the other animals. The Great Spirit condemned Coyote to howl at the stars every night to punish him for his laziness and his dishonesty. I have heard that scattered yip-yapping, howling, barking call for many years in the middle of the night. It's haunting and comforting at the same time. And once in a while, when voices like these wake me from a deep sleep, I muster the courage to rise out of bed at 3 a.m. usually, and grab my recorder to go out into the night and capture those voices of coyotes. I've only managed to do it once, so I'm going to share my one precious audio clip with you after years of trying. So listen closely. On this episode of Here in the City, we explore the relationship coyotes have with humans in urban spaces in today's Southern California. Some 5,000 coyotes live in Southern California, and they have for over 100 years, probably much longer. They live all over the continent in all sorts of landscapes, but nowhere across the 50 states are coyotes as comfortable in an urban setting as they are in Los Angeles. So here we go. This is Here in the City, and I am here at the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area in Thousand Oaks, California.
It was the city hall for years, and until they moved. But now it's the home of the National Park Service. We've got 75 employees that work here.
And what part of California are we in?
Well, we're just across, not too far from Los Angeles County line, but we're actually in Ventura County now. And it's very directly south of us is the ocean. Most people think of the ocean as in the west, but this is a mountain range that runs east and west instead of north and south in California, which is very unusual.
How did you come to work with the National Park Service?
Well, I'm a volunteer. So I quit my job 4 years ago, and I'd never been in here, and I walked in, and they said, you can be a volunteer, and you can get a uniform, and and you can get to work with all these great rangers, which is fantastic. They really know a lot.
What's your name?
My name is Bob Peltzman.
Thank you very much. I went out to the mountains of Ventura County on a windy day to talk to Seth Riley of the National Park Service. He's the author of a book called Urban Carnivores, and he's a specialist in the ecology and conservation of wildlife in fragmented urban landscapes.
Coyotes are indeed very successful in urban areas. They reach some of their highest densities and have some of their smallest home ranges in urban areas.
Home ranges?
Yeah,
okay.
sorry.
What does that mean?
The home range is the area that an animal generally uses, roams across.
So like their own individual territory?
Exactly, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So my job with the Park Service is as the wildlife ecologist, but our job in the parks in general, in all the parks, is to do our best to preserve the resources in those parks for future generations. And for me, that means the wildlife resources. So my job is to do my best to preserve all the wildlife populations. And so, but in a park like Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, where we're right next to Los Angeles, we have some different challenges than you might say at Yosemite or Yellowstone or something like that. So all of the work that we do here at Santa Monica Mountains is focused on understanding what are the impacts of urbanization and fragmentation on wildlife populations and communities. We're a big, beautiful, sort of great park, but we're also absolutely an urban park. In fact, we're the biggest urban national park, is my understanding. And so from an animal perspective, and from a plant perspective largely too, we really think the biggest threat in our area generally is urbanization and fragmentation. So we've been studying carnivores since 1996. So that means coyotes, bobcats, and now mountain lions as well in the park. And the reason we started with carnivores is, and we continue to work with them, is they need a huge amount of space. So when habitat is being lost and fragmented by development, carnivores are one of the groups that you would expect to be especially affected. So we, from 96 to 2003, we did this 9-year study where we captured 130 coyotes and we radio tracked 110 of them. We collected their poop and to look at their diets, and we did lots of different stuff.
Tell me a little bit about what you found out about them that was surprising.
They really are, and this every time I, give a talk about this kind of stuff or whatever, I often focus on it. They really are focused still, even in this urban landscape, on natural areas and natural foods. So, for example, coyotes, as with all animals, there's lots of individual variation. So we had some animals that were very heavily using developed areas and urban areas and stuff, but we had many that never went out into the urban areas, and on average 75%, well, it's about 2/3, about 66% of their home ranges were natural, and 3/4 of their actual locations, where we actually found them, were in natural areas. So
what does natural mean in this context? Really,
well,
in an urban context,
yes,
Southern California.
Well, that's a good question, and that's something in urban ecology you have to think about all the time. What does natural mean and what does urban mean? We divide the landscape up into 3 categories, so they're fairly coarse, but one was intense development, so high density residential areas, commercial areas, that kind of thing. And then on the other side is natural areas, so all of the parkland, so national parklands, state parklands, conservancy parks, anything that is essentially relatively unmanaged, undeveloped, natural,
protected area.
Right, yeah, but that's not planted grass and mowed and that kind of thing.
Not a garden.
Exactly.
So
yeah,
what's
or
the
a
third?
Field or whatever. And the third was what we called these altered open areas. So things like golf courses, or there's a landfill in the middle of the park, or office parks, or developed parks that are sort of ball fields and that kind of thing. So areas that they're certainly not as one thing that's pretty common in Southern California actually is very low density residential areas. So gated communities with they're residential, but there's big lots with often sometimes even relatively natural habitat sort of in between them. On average, most of the time they're spending in natural areas. And the same thing was true of their diets. So we collected scats and we went through them and sort of washed them until we got just hair and bones and seeds and things like that so we could see what they were eating. And the vast majority of their diet is natural items. So
let's take a little break from washing coyote scat. This is Here in the City. I'm Sara Harris. We'll take a short break from our coyote show, and we will continue with Seth Riley at the National Park Service in the Santa Monica Mountains.
This is what it is. This is what it's going to be. You are listening to Here in the City on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles,
98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and 99.5 FM in Ridgecrest and China Lake. An archive and a podcast of our shows is at Here in the City, that's HEAR in the city.org.
and at kpfk.org. You can like us on Facebook
if you like,
and visit us at our website, hereinthecity.org.
And follow us on Twitter.
actually, fruit is a major item. They're omnivorous, like raccoons, as opposed to, say, bobcats, which are pretty strict carnivores. So in the...
Those cats, they just like to eat meat.
Exactly. No, it's true. Yeah. So in the summer, fall, there's a lot of fruit in the coyote diet. So it's 2/3 to 75% of their scats have fruit in them. And then after that, rabbits were the most common prey. Those are also important for bobcat diets. And a lot of the, what we call anthropogenic items, so human-related items like trash and domestic pets, so cats and dogs, and pet food, those were present. We found them occasionally, but they were a tiny percentage of the diet. So what that means to us is that the coyotes are basically preferring, when they can, to live in natural areas and preferring to eat relatively natural foods. The one exception, which is interesting, which is more the case, say, in Southern California than in Chicago or some of these other cities, is ornamental fruit was actually the most important non-sort of natural item in coyote diet. So
what is ornamental fruit?
Well, so in other words, plants that are planted that aren't native, that are planted by people. So that might be in yards or in parks or things like that. So
like oranges or peach
trees? Yeah, exactly. Peaches, plums, cherries, pyracantha were all very commonly in coyote diet. So those things were a little bit more common. But like I said, things like trash and pet food and even pets were, like cats, we found in like 1% of the scats.
Really?
So,
only 1% of the coyotes that you tracked had cat
of the
remains.
Scats that we looked at, yeah. Now, but I'll always say that doesn't mean A, that it doesn't happen, and B, that it isn't important. Because I'm a cat owner, and I would be very sad if my cat was killed by a coyote. And so every time a pet is killed by a coyote, that's a big deal to that pet owner, absolutely. What we're seeing is it's not a major part of what the coyotes are relying on.
75-80% of the time, the coyotes, even if they're living in an urban area like Southern California,
right,
they don't want to be and aren't in developed parts of the city.
Exactly. Yeah, and so there's one sort of example that I always use, but I think it's a really interesting one, is that we had an animal that we collared in the park. So the sort of main part of the national park north of 101 is in the Agoura Hills area. There's a few canyons there, Cheeseboro, Palacamato Canyon. And we collared her there, but she dispersed out into the middle of the San Fernando Valley. And as you know, the San Fernando Valley is basically a sea of development. But it was really interesting because every time we found her, she was either at Sepulveda Basin, which has a few golf courses and a tiny little bit of sort of relatively natural area right by the dam, or she was at Pierce College, which again is, not exactly sort of natural, but
There's a quad.
Exactly. It has some relatively natural areas.
Fountains.
We would call them altered open areas probably, but still they're not intense development. So she was bouncing back and forth between those two spots. And if you drew a line around all of her points and made what we call a home range, 75% of that was developed. But if you looked at her actual points, 75% of them were not in developed areas. She was kind of finding what, was at least most closely approximating natural areas in the San Fernando Valley.
So what are they like socially, coyotes? How big are the groups that they live in, and what's the day in the life of a coyote like?
Well, so the coyotes they're definitely social animals. So most mammals are not terribly social. Like, for example, the bobcats and the mountain lions, the males don't hang out with the females in general. The males have much larger home ranges, and they're just out there to overlap with as many females as they can, basically. And the females do all of the taking care of the offspring. And that's true in lions and bobcats, most felids, and lots of mammals, actually. But canids, including wolves and foxes and coyotes, are more social, and their basic unit is, in coyotes, is the pair. But then they can be in much larger groups, and you may have, or many people will have sometimes seen groups of 5 to 10 coyotes, and usually that will be an alpha pair plus maybe offspring from a couple of years. So some of the offspring may hang around in that group for longer. And they do actually dig dens, and so they will have the young. The females will have the young, and the males will use the dens too, mostly. I mean, not always, but mostly. But they are not using those dens year round. So they're generally sleeping, and sometimes in some amazing places, but they're generally just sleeping in any area of more cover. We've found them, that I remember radio tracking a coyote in the Oak Park area where there was a pretty major road, Canaan Road, and then there was a developed park, like, ball fields and stuff, and there was just a single line of hedges in between, and the coyote was, spending the afternoon sleeping in that hedge. I mean, that's somewhat unusual, but so in general, they will find whatever sort of more protected areas they can and sleep in those.
And when you say that they're of the smartest animals that you've encountered in urban carnivores, what is it? Like, what makes you believe that they're that clever? They do have a fame for that in Native American culture also.
Sure, yeah. Coyotes are very smart about that. So, for example, they will learn. So if there's a couple people working for a particular agency, for example, that are doing hazing, but most people are not, the coyotes will figure that out, and they will figure out who is doing the hazing, and they will run from those people, and they will not run from anyone else. Or they will even figure out, so particular trucks that carry those agency people, they will learn to run and respond to the trucks, but again, not respond to other people. So it's actually one thing that makes it very hard to sort of counter their habituation, because they're very smart. Really what you need is, it sort of takes a community, right? You need everyone to be thinking about, okay, we want coyotes to be more wary of people, because if there's some people
and when they
that are doing that, but most people are not, and then some people are even feeding them or something.
Like Seth Riley said, coyotes generally want to stay away from people in the city, but they do live among us here. This is their place too. And I wanted to know more about what we should do when those errant canines do come down into the canyons and the parks, and how should we best deal with it. So Seth suggested I call Officer Gregory Randall, the one wildlife specialist for the city of Los Angeles, who is another sort of coyote expert.
Officer Randall.
Hi, Officer Randall. It's Sara Harris calling from here in the city.
Hello.
Hello. So, I know that you are a very busy person, and
It does turn out to be that way much of the time.
yeah. Can you just jump right in and tell me, why is that? How would you describe the job that you do for the city of Los Angeles?
Well, it's a unique position because very few agencies or cities, governments have a wildlife specialist that helps the public with their various wildlife questions and issues. But it's basically, the idea now is public education, making people aware of what types of animals live here in the city that are always going to be here, and ways that we can have kind of a harmonious living environment with them. and trying to reduce a lot of the fear that people have about wildlife, because we have a very fear-based society when it comes to wild animals due to a lot of past hype about what animals are capable of, and people are very frightened of what they don't understand. I try to walk people through the process of understanding what these animals are here for, what purposes they serve, so that they're less frightening to them.
So that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you, because they're anecdotally, I have noticed, and my neighbors and other people who live in the different foothill and canyon areas of Los Angeles, we've just noticed more coyotes than we have, let's say, in the past 10 to 15 years. And again, it's not scientific, but it is something we've noticed. And what are we supposed to do? I don't even know. I mean, my instinct tells me one thing, which is make a lot of noise and, try to scare it or act threatening. And that worked, but it's at the same time, the same animal came back the next night and the night after.
It's going to be more than just using scare tactics. Change in animal behavior is not easy, just as change in human behavior is not easy. And along with scare tactics, you have to have property alteration, deterrence, and exclusionary methods to prevent further situations from happening. When I say the word prevent, that's a loose term, because you're still likely to have reoccurrences of the animal showing up. It just may be different if you've made that particular animal frightened of humans, which is what we need them to be. It's safer for them, it's safer for us. You're not going to get an animal that, you might scare it a couple of times and it may stay away, or it might come back because there are other things going on around your home, attraction sources maybe from the neighbors that are keeping it coming back.
Aha, like food that's left out, which my neighbors do for the wild cats. It's a cultural norm that exists in my neighborhood, and I know it brings the coyotes down from the hills.
Yes, leaving out pet food for domestic, animals and not picking it up can be an attraction source for a variety of wildlife. And, feeding your pet outside is not illegal, but if you're putting food out and wild mammals are eating from that food, predatory mammals, that is illegal, whether you intended to feed that animal or not.
You're subject to a fine if you do that.
Correct. It's upwards of $1,000 fine and 6 months in jail. We try to notify the person first. We, warn them about what to do so that they're not likely to cause that problem again. Usually once people find out the fine and the associated with that behavior, they will make the alteration to reduce the likelihood of happening again.
So that brings us to this sort of strange border between humans in urban spaces and encroaching development, and animals like coyotes, for whatever reason, are able to adapt to smaller areas for moving around, but still they are wild animals, then they're carnivores.
Yes. As we encroach upon natural lands, things will change. However, though, I should point out that it's a misnomer. A lot of people think that coyotes should only live in the mountains and foothills. Coyotes are across the entire United States. There are 19 variations of the coyote, and they've been seen in the U.S. and Canada and Mexico. And having a coyote on the flatlands is not an abnormal thing. And a lot of people think that when they see a coyote, there must be something wrong because they see it maybe come down a mile from the hills or whatever. Coyotes will travel throughout the range looking for whatever food source they can find, and have learned often from the parent animal where to find that food source. And we as humans, being habitual in many things that we do, put our pet in the backyard and leave food outside for it, we're setting up a situation in a lot of cases where we attract the animal, and we still have to feed our pets. So even more so than just the presence of the food and the encroachment on natural lands, we've had animals have become very used to seeing people. And a lot of people, the reaction is to run or not do anything. And this is basically let the animals know it's okay for them to be where they are. And granted, this is their environment also. But we want to teach those animals to continue to have the fear of people. It's very important that, even if the person doesn't feel threatened by the animal, to use scare tactics to frighten that animal away so it's less likely to approach another person.
What have you seen change since you started your job as a wildlife specialist for the city?
I think the most profound thing for me is that people in the past that used to trap wildlife on a regular basis calling me and saying, Officer Randall, I spent thousands of dollars on trapping wildlife, but after the tips you provided on what to do to discourage the animals and how to make the property alterations, they're still seeing the animals, but not as often, or they're not in habitation on that person's property, or people that had maybe raccoons getting into their attic every year to have babies. The simple thing of cutting the tree branches away from the roof solved their problem, but 3 years before that, no one ever told them, and they were spending so much money on all these trapping processes to remove animals. So I think that was very encouraging, and probably next to that would be children in the schools learning about wildlife and what to expect when they get out into the adult world, when I go and do public education.
And you have a closer at the end of your emails that says FEAR, fear. And what does that stand for?
FEAR is an acronym, as well as a word, for face everything and recover, or forget everything and run. And you have to choose which one you're going to do. So I prefer that people would choose to face everything and recover, and find other methods of dealing with things than just to run away from the situation. And also, if they're researching an animal, if they see an animal that they're afraid of, it's good to look at it on the internet, but try and avoid looking at it from a group that might have a financial supplement from a contact from that person. In other words, like someone that might be a trapper or something like that that's giving advice.
I met somebody who used to, her father would trap coyotes for the Keck family in the Hollywood Hills in the 50s and 60s. And that was his job in the off season. He was a trapper. Did they really used to do that?
There still are a lot of companies and people that trap wildlife, although for here in the city of Los Angeles, we're not allowing the trapping of wildlife just because somebody saw an animal. The pest control companies do have permits from the Department of Fish and Game or the State Pest Control Board to trap wildlife. We are not providing traps here, and it's not allowed for the public to use rented or borrowed traps or traps they've purchased to trap an animal. They must go through a professional company.
Indeed, at the Visitor Center in the Anza Borrego Desert, I met Pamela McAvoy, who told me about how her father made a living back in the 1950s and 60s in the Hollywood Hills as a trapper.
The Keck used to hire him on his estate to trap the coyotes and remove them. And then the county hired him because their trappers couldn't cut down on the population. So they hired my father, and he would trap them because he knew how. He had lived with the Maumee Indians for 3 years as a young child, and so he knew all about their ways. And so he always used to tell me, now there's Hollywood wolves and then there's coyotes, Pam. So he used to write the comic strip, a syndicated strip called Dixie Dugan. His name was Rennie McAvoy. And he worked in the movies, and he was a bit actor, and his syndicated comic strip kept everybody going while he worked in the movies. And trapped coyotes, as he was called all the time by big people who wanted them removed from their property because they were coming down into the property. And I went with him once when they had come into this woman's back barnyard and had eaten the back end of a...
Okay, I have to stop right there. What Pamela has to say is too gruesome.
To yapping on. When you go in and out, may you have peace and level and safe.
Yes.
Be safe.
Peace.